Welcome to this episode of MetaWell. As a reminder, my name is Adam Froer.
I'm Cecil Walker.
Cecil, it's nice to see
Always great to see you.
you.
You doing all right?
Yeah, not bad. How about you?
Can't complain. Well, there's plenty to complain about. I usually don't complain.
That's true. Yeah, you usually don't complain. Today we're going to talk about a continuation of physical well-being. We kind of did a general overview of physical well-being last time, and this time we're going to really kind of hone in on nutrition a bit, and we're going to hone in on kind of the impacts of what we eat on kind of other parts of our well-being. Maybe you can start us off with saying, why does nutrition matter? Why in the world of well-being should we think about nutrition?
Well, last time we spent a bit of time talking about how all of the components of well-being are very connected and how you can't really separate them or say which one comes first or anything like that. But I do think something that's foundational to all well-being, whatever way you want to describe well-being, if you think that's just being healthy, if you think that's being happy, if you think that's, just liking how things are operating in your life, whatever way you define well-being, I think a foundational element to that is, how is your body functioning? Do you feel well in a physical sense? And one of the key determinants of that is, what are you putting into your body? What are you doing to your body? What are you letting your body use to function on? And that's where nutrition, I think, comes in. It sounds so simple and so basic, but we use this logic for, almost anything else. Like if you have a sports car or something like that, and you want it to be operating at its highest capacity, you can't throw whatever kind of oil you want into it. You can't use the wrong kind of fuel. The parts that you put on it and allow it to use, those can't just be whatever rinky-dink parts that you found lying around. You're going to want to put the best stuff into it so that it operates at its best. And it's very, very simple, and the same for us. If we put the best stuff into us, and best not even meaning luxury stuff, best just meaning what's optimal for our body to run on, which usually is just variety of organic nutrients. That's why it's important to talk about nutrition, because it that's the foundation. It starts to go up to everything, including, as we'll probably talk about a bit today, it can affect your neurology and how your brain functions. It can affect your psychology because of that, your mood, how you're feeling, anxiety, depression, which all these things can affect how you're socializing, how you're operating at work and in your family. And those things can affect, everything else. It just keeps rippling and rippling. And all of that can find some roots in, what are you putting into your body? I'm sure plenty of people could better describe why nutrition is important, but there's my stab at it.
Yeah, it's good. I think one of the things that comes to my mind as I think about nutrition at the very basic level, it all comes down to chemistry, right? It's just like
Mhm.
various like chemical compounds that we're putting into our body, which may sound, kind of nerdy or unimportant, but at the same time, when you think about our nervous system and when you think about your cells and what they're made of, it all is just like chemical compounds. That the way that our brains and our nervous system functions, it's just sending chemicals across very small spaces, and we have to have the right nutrients to make that work really well and effectively. When you think about like all of our other organs and systems, it just comes down to how they use various nutrients. And if we're putting those nutrients into our bodies, then they're there and they're readily available. If we're not putting those nutrients into our bodies, then our bodies have choices to make of like, okay, so I don't have these nutrients, how am I going to keep doing my job? And I think sometimes that's then how illness develops, which is obviously the opposite of what we're trying to focus on, which is wellness. So if we're trying to promote wellness, we need to, in some sense, promote putting the right chemicals, nutrients into our bodies that then helps our bodies to function as well as possible. And so I think that's a really just basic, simplistic way of thinking about it. The hard thing now is that so much of the world either doesn't have access to the right kinds of foods, or they don't the right quantities of food, or we have created such a lifestyle of like time pressures and being overscheduled and all of those kinds of things that taking those right nutrients into our bodies sometimes can be time consuming. And so we don't have time, so we've moved to processed foods. And so I think one of the things that's really important when we think about like physical well-being, particularly around nutrition, but it might require thought, it might require some planning, it might require some working around busyness or eliminating some busyness in order to get it into our systems. And so again, I think that kind of highlights this interconnectivity that if my work life balance is out of whack, then that's going to impact my well-being, but it's also going
Mhm.
to impact my physical well-being in that I might not have the ability to plan effectively to be a good consumer of nutrition.
Mhm. Glad you mentioned that because if we're going to talk about something as specific as nutrition and what you eat, that inherently brings into the conversation what do you have access to? And I think there's a very robust underlying economics to talking about that because it kind of is a privilege to have access to the quality kinds of foods that we're going to be talking about to change your diet and your lifestyle in a way that you now can access and improve your well-being in these kinds of ways that we're talking about. And it's not just economics in terms of having the money. That definitely is huge. The money to buy, good high quality produce, single ingredient kinds of foods rather than fast food or overproduced foods. All those kinds of things do cost more, but also the economics, like you said, of time. If you're working a certain kind of a job, or you maybe are the only person responsible for the children in your family, or you're taking care of extended family, maybe whatever it is, you don't have the extra time, you don't have those other resources that allow you to put more planning into what you're eating or take time away from these other responsibilities, as well as just physical access to foods. I mean, there are places where, what's good for you just isn't that easy to get to. It's hard to find an array of vegetables and fruits and stuff if you live, somewhere in what they call like a food desert. There's places even in the US itself that we've seen stories of how like Dollar General is the main food provider for a certain community or something like that. And I hardly think that all of the foods that you need to live a healthy, fulfilling kind of lifestyle are always going to be available at Dollar General. No shade to Dollar General, but the variety that we need just doesn't come in that kind of a place. That is something definitely to consider. But what I'll say is that all of us in any position, there's room for improvement, with the things that we do have. Any step forward, any investment in your well-being is a good investment and a well-placed investment. And so maybe you can't have fresh fruits and vegetables 7 days a week. Maybe you can't plan out a full array of menus of these great foods that are great for you 7 days a week. But one meal on one day, you can provide whatever it is that improves that meal. And that's better than how you used to eat before. If you used to go to McDonald's 5 days a week and instead you go only 4 days a week, because one day you can make the time to actually have a meal at home, that's an improvement too. I think it's just worth acknowledging there's difference in access and availability, but there's still agency in, well, change for me is specific to me, and whatever I do and how I change that still can be improvement in my well-being compared to what might be the case for someone else.
Yeah, I think that's a really important component for us to think about. Like, very realistically, we're all kind of in different places on the well-being spectrum, and there's lots of factors that contribute to why we are where we are on the well-being spectrum. The thing though that I think is really valuable, we were talking before, and I think this is a good place maybe to introduce this about Dr. Robert Lustig's work. And he has written a few books about this. And one of the major books that written is it's called In Hacking the American Mind. And it's connected to food. And so we'll talk a little bit about like physical consumption, but he also talks a bit about screens and how we are consuming large data and consuming lots of screen time. And so perhaps there's also beyond just physical nutrition that we're taking into our body, perhaps there's, you know, educational or economic or physiological nutrition that we're taking in. But one of the major premises of what he talks about is that he distinguishes happiness from pleasure. And maybe this is a good place for us to start. And he again, kind of going back to that neurochemistry and kind of the biological chemistry, he talks about how pleasure is oftentimes really short term, that it's addictive by nature, and that we need more and more of this pleasure in order to feel satisfied over time. We kind of get used to it. And that's kind of that addictive nature. And one of the things that he talks about is that this is really driven by the dopamine in our system. The dopamine is oftentimes what we call the pleasure hormone. But again, this dopamine kind of spikes and then it fades away, and we kind of seek after that like spike of dopamine, which contributes to this addictive nature. And then he contrasts that with the idea of happiness, which is driven by serotonin, which is a different hormone in our body. And this serotonin is also a feel-good hormone, but it's a longer term hormone. It's kind of leads to long-term satisfaction or contentment and tends to have very low levels of addiction. And so much of what he talks about is this distinction between pleasure and happiness. And maybe just a question for you as you think about this is um, it kind of sets up a dynamic potentially where we look at pleasure as a bad thing and happiness as a good thing. And so my question for you is that the case? Is that dichotomy a good representation when we're thinking about these kinds of things?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. And I'll say this is also a great book too. It touches on so many areas of well-being, and it kind of emphasizes what, we keep talking about is how all of these areas are just so locked hand in hand, and how, acknowledging, improving, and doing something about one area inherently influences other areas, or you have to address both of them, all of them at the same time, even. But to your question about how, it brings up this dichotomy of pleasure and happiness. Does that mean one is good and one is bad? Is pleasure bad, happiness good? I think what's really a key lens to use when looking at any component to just the human condition, whether that's medical health or mental health, or social health or financial health, any of these things, any of these areas of well-being, is that there's no really, especially when we're talking about medical, physical things, there's no good and bad, I think, to the processes that are happening inside of us. These are just natural processes that happen and respond to, the environment that we're in, and the resources that we give our bodies. Just like sugar isn't inherently bad, fat isn't
Mm.
inherently bad. You would agree with the sugar part, I'm sure. um,
Sugar
uh,
definitely is not all bad.
but water isn't inherently good, right? And vitamins and minerals aren't just magically all this cure all fantastic, have as much as you need as you want of those things. What is good and bad is how much of those things, the ideal amount of these things that you're supposed to be getting, and the frequency, the timing, the use, the context of those things. It's, am I using these appropriately? Am I getting the appropriate amount in the appropriate context and in the appropriate frequency? Um, like water is a great example. They always say you should have lots of water, drink lots of water. Yes, because there's an appropriate amount that you're supposed to have for your body to operate efficiently. And there's a lot of discomforts and ailments that can be improved by having more water than less water. There is a maximum. There's a level to which you go beyond that, and you're doing yourself a disservice. You're waterlogging your body. You're giving yourself too much water, and that can be detrimental. That can be even fatal. So yes, water can be used well for the
Mm.
efficiency of your body, but is water this magic thing that if you just infinitely give yourself as much as possible, it will infinitely give you returns on? No, that's not true. And I think the same logic can be applied over to how we might be quick to think of pleasure and dopamine as a negative thing. Dopamine is for prompting you to do things that this moment requires you to do. It's definitely a very fleeting thing. It's a very quick thing, but it's useful in that your body needs something in that moment. It needs something. It uses a chemical that's fast acting to get you to get that thing rather than serotonin, which is this long-term sustaining thing. It can't wait for you to. Serotonin has the luxury of time and waiting and investment, while dopamine is much more related to the things that it might want you to do right now, which is why addiction is what's associated with that neurochemical. Um, it seems to be bad when we overuse it because we keep going after the things that give us a ton of dopamine in this instant right now, and those things aren't great for us. But it used to be, and what the context that dopamine developed under was if there's something that is scarce or hard to get a hold of, or you don't know the next opportunity you'll have at this thing, dopamine comes into play because it wants you to take advantage of this thing right now. And sugar used to be something that was quite scarce and hard to get a hold of. You wouldn't know the next time you'd have access to that high amount of energy carbohydrates in such a small form. And so we would have this impulse to consume it to take advantage of that moment. The same can apply to lots of other things. The unfortunate thing is now we mostly have access to plenty of sugar very easily. And so we keep acting on that impulse to take advantage of it. Now, what used to be a very tiny part of our overall diet can become the majority of it, a very oversized portion of it, which throws the entire system out of whack. Hopefully that starts to shine a little bit of light on how there isn't really good and bad to it. It's are you doing what's best, right? All those questions that I threw out of is it in the right context and for the right use? Are you using it appropriately? And that's I feel like something that applies to lots of things in well-being, but most certainly in the things that you're eating. Because if you only eat spinach, you're gonna have problems too. You
Mm.
have to be appropriate with all of these things.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good distinction, and I think that's a it's a worthwhile thing to think about in well-being is really we're trying to find a balance. We're trying to find a moderation in these things. We're trying to find a level that is satisfactory, not too much, not too little. And I think that's one of the things as I think about this concept as far as the difference between dopamine and serotonin. They oftentimes call serotonin the contentment neurotransmitter of like you feel content. You don't need more, you don't need less. You're kind of at that balance. And so I think when we think about foods that contribute to a balance of serotonin, um, it's going to be like the balanced diet of finding a good amount of protein, less carbohydrates than typically we've been taught in the past, lots of healthy fruits and vegetables, raw foods, like you mentioned before, one ingredient foods. Whereas it's interesting because they call dopamine the reward neurotransmitter, and there is like I do something and so I get a reward for it. And usually it's just think about like little kids when you say like I'm going to give you a sticker. There's so much excitement that like builds up that it's like they're bouncing off the walls. They're so excited about it. And that's kind of the impact that dopamine has on our system as well, is like overactivates it. That long-term dopamine exposure, it ultimately leads to exhaustion. That's why we call it like a sugar crash. And so it's like you've been up for so long that all of a sudden your body just can't manage. And that distinction between are we trying to reward ourselves or are we trying to find contentment? I think that's a really good I like way of managing and thinking about well-being. When we think about well-being, it's not that we need to reward ourselves, but it's that we feel content, we feel at peace, we feel kind of settled in this process. And so I think that's one of the real values of nutrition, but not just physical nutrition, food nutrition, but like mental nutrition or psychological nutrition. And Lustig, he really also kind of makes an equal comparison between like consuming addictive content online. We now know like people just doom scroll for days, right? We know that people oftentimes like just let their entire well-being go out the window because they're just playing video games all night long. Video games and social media content, it is so psychologically constructed that it like gives this like boost, this dopamine boost to our brain, and then it slowly wears off and we get another boost. We go to the next level or we scroll into the next video. Everything has been constructed to just build on dopamine. And so I think one of the really important things as we're thinking about well-being in this way is that it takes our own decision making to say, I'm going to not put myself in a situation where I'm going to get this overload of reward dopamine, but that I'll set limits. Maybe I'll set a timer and say I'm only going to consume content for a certain amount of time. Maybe we set portions around our food where we say, okay, I'm going to eat all of these healthy things. Like one really simple solution to kind of finding this contentment in serotonin is that we eat fruits and vegetables, leafy greens first. When we sit down to a balanced diet, we sit down and there's, hopefully some green things and some colorful fruits and vegetables on our plate. By eating those things first, we trigger our digestive system to absorb as many of the nutrients as possible. Just that one decision kind of shifts. And then if we move to the protein next, then our body can consume as much protein as possible. When we've done those two things, kind of triggered our immune system or our digestive system, and then we've absorbed as much protein as we can, we hit this level of contentment. We feel full, we feel satisfied, we feel satiated. So the need for carbohydrates goes down significantly. That desire for sugar and that dopamine, it goes away because I feel content. And so I think that's one of the things that is really, I think, important when we think about nutrition, but I think overall well-being is if we're thoughtful about how to get to contentment, then the need or the desire for excitement or reward or dopamine, it significantly goes down, and that battle gets a bit easier. Simply by changing the way that I make choices at the beginning, it makes choices later on much easier, simply because my body just doesn't need or want it as much.
Mhm. I think you're absolutely right. And I think this is such a great way to frame the lives that we live. Because if you live a life searching for bouncing from dopamine hit to dopamine hit, you will have momentary highs, which just the way that the neurochemistry works, those highs get lower and lower each time too, which is why people need more and more of the thing that they're getting their dopamine from. If you live that kind of life, bouncing from dopamine high to dopamine high, not only are the in-betweens very low and unsatisfying, but you're now very beholden to those things that give you those bursts, momentary bursts, very, very temporary bursts. And that's different than the life you could live if you lived a life where you tried to sustain serotonin. And that's the difference between these two sides is one is short bursts with lots of discomfort and unhappiness in between. And the other is a sustaining happiness, a contentment. This is long term. This is something that lasts. This is a way of being, a lifestyle. And so I think if you look at any component to your life, certainly nutrition, you have to start to be intentional about, is this contributing to the lifestyle that I want to live? Or is this me chasing something that's going to give me a burst right now? Chasing the bursts leads you down a path that gets harder and harder to come back from, while investing in a sustainable kind of a lifestyle is giving yourself constant returns. You're entering into a cycle of I'm always going to be satisfied. I'm always going to be happy. I say always. I'm going to be generally happy and satisfied. I'm going to give myself the best chance at a life that is sustainably good and sustainably happy. If you invest too heavily in the dopamine side, you learn that there's nothing there. There's no substance. So in terms of food, you can't sustain yourself on, just candy alone. You can't sustain yourself. You might want to.
It's too bad, really.
But even you, as much love for sugar as you have, the body itself just can't operate off of that. If you had a week or a month or whatever time of only eating candy, you would see how that just doesn't work. I mean, just to feel sick it would
Mm.
be the easiest way out of that situation. But if you built a life where you said, I'm going to make choices that sustain a life of serotonin, a life of constant contentment, or give my body what it needs continuously, that's going to look more like, oh, well, I eat a variety of foods. It's also going to look like I get enough sleep consistently, not just one night, not just two nights, but I have a pattern of getting an ample amount of sleep at an appropriate time too. I think you can always kind of use this frame for any of the decisions that you might be trying to make. You could make a choice for right now, what's going to give me a burst of dopamine, what's going to feel good, be easy, be that direction that I can go in that my senses are going to be very, very pleased with, or I can go in the direction of here's an investment in myself. Here's something that's going to make me feel good too, but it's a different kind of feel good. It's a contentment that is stretched out over long periods of time. This is the happily ever after. This is the long term. This is the life, the lifestyle. The other is this is the moment. This is right now. I'm not saying that those shouldn't ever exist. But you can't have a life of right nows. You have to have a life of the entire picture. You have to have a life of investment. That's the only way I think that you can really live and be content with the way that you're living consistently.
Yeah. I think maybe just one final thing about this is nutrition obviously impacts serotonin and it impacts dopamine. But I think, again, it's one component, and I don't want to like hone in on like one thing at the expense of something else. And I think oftentimes nutrition and exercise go hand in hand. And that's kind of how we find a balance. It's how much we're consuming versus how much we're exerting. And it's interesting because when you look at the impact of exercise on serotonin and dopamine, exercise impacts both. But one of the things that I think is really valuable, exercise increases the production of both serotonin and dopamine. It also increases how receptive the neurotransmitters are, right? So that when we exercise, our neurons are more susceptible to serotonin, but they're also more susceptible to dopamine. But one of the things that I think is really important about it is that when we exercise, there's this neurotransmitter in our brain that's called the D2 receptor. And it makes our brains more sensitive to dopamine. But one of the things I think that's really valuable about that is that it's a natural way to create that reward circuitry, which means that it reduces our cravings on other things. It reduces our cravings on sugar. It reduces our cravings on drugs or other unhealthy things. And so what happens is that it's the natural physical way of, in essence, preventing addiction, that as we consume good nutrition and we exert good nutrition, in essence, it's this self-protective barrier to addiction. And so again, I don't want to say, like you were saying at the beginning, of like, well, serotonin is great and dopamine is bad. That's actually not what we're saying here. We're saying when we do this in the right balance, when we produce these things in the natural, healthy way, we're actually preventing the detrimental impacts of dopamine because we're getting that in a healthy way. We find this level of contentment, we find a really kind of balanced homeostasis within our body. And so I think it's just having a way, being aware of these things then helps us to be able to make useful decisions to say, how much do I want to exercise? And usually it only takes like 30 to 60 minutes in a day to kind of build up this D2 sensitivity to dopamine in our bodies. So it's not a lot, and it doesn't have to be rigorous, right? It can be walking, it can be jogging, it can be, an easy swim. We're not saying like go out and crush it every single day. We're saying do things in moderation, do things with regularity, just be mindful, thoughtful about these things, and your body naturally can kind of help protect itself against extremes on either end of this.
Mhm. Yeah, I completely agree. I guess that's the best way to summarize it is physical well-being is just giving your body what it needs in the most basic components, rather than, which I think is becoming more and more common, is we're constantly stretching ourselves in the opposite direction, seeing how much we can get away with just barely giving ourselves the things that we need to thrive on. And so rather than finding the smallest amount to give yourself, trying to find what's the ideal amount, what's the exact right amount, what's the balance of all of these components that will really make me feel the best and operate the best.
Yeah. Anything else you want to make sure that we get to?
No, I think after two conversations on physical well-being, I feel like we're really starting to capture as much of the puzzle as possible.
Yeah, I think so. And I hope this is helpful for people. I hope that this kind of helps you kind of think about how do I make good decisions? How do I plan effectively? How do I give my body what it needs? But also, how do these things in the physical well-being realm impact other parts of my well-being? Because it kind of all stays interconnected. Well, hopefully that's helpful. Please let us know what thoughts, what reactions you have. If you find that this is helpful for you and you think other people might benefit from it, please feel free to share it. We would really appreciate it. That means a lot to us. But in the meantime, go be well.